All right, welcome everybody to our virtual roundtable on exhibit education and interactives. We're excited to have you here today. Happy St. Patrick's Day to everybody. And I'm joined today by our museum educator, Danielle Harris Burnett, who's going to be talking about all things wonderfully educational and interactive. And I think has some great information for you all. And again, it is a roundtable, so we definitely are excited to have folks share as well as listen. So with that, I am going to start presenting as soon as it loads. All right, so this is our slideshow interactive. So again, for those of you who have or have not done it before, if you choose to collaborate within Zoom itself, you can put answers in directly on the slides. You can also use the code that shows up at the top of the slides on a separate device, like a phone or something, and do interactive pieces from there. So this, I guess, is our first example of an interactive. And so I'm going to move right to our second slide, which is sort of the question about what are some of our favorite interactives from museums that you have visited. And again, for those of you who haven't been here before, you are welcome to also put information in the chat, either on the question or about yourselves or questions that you might have. So any favorite interactives? And I'm actually going to start by asking Danielle to share her favorite interactive.
This was such a hard decision to make, because this is kind of what I look at every time I visit a different museum. Um, so I think looking back, one of my favorites that I've ever seen, was actually in Lynchburg, Virginia. So at the Children's Museum of Amazement Square, there's a canal table where you can look at the different water levels, and it's actually you can run the boats through. So I think that I don't know, that entire experience and how hands-on a lot of that museum was kind of influenced how much I wanted to study museums. So that was definitely a big impact.
Awesome. Yeah, I know. I was trying to think of my favorite interactives, and I also was having a hard time kind of deciding. I do remember again, I think kind of this question of some of the ones that were maybe more formative. Um,
Mhm.
when I was a little younger, going to Washington, D.C. and going to some of the museums there and getting like the Air and Space
Mhm.
Museum. And I can't even remember the exact interactives, but I remember it being that chance to really sort of interact with the pieces there in a different way. And so that was really cool for my.
Well, and with Air and Space Museum, there's a lot of different opportunities to see either a reconstruction of a cockpit or go into the accessioned crafts in the museum. So I think those were also cool.
Awesome. Anybody
Does
else want
anyone
to
else?
share? Oop, sorry, Danielle, go ahead.
No, it's okay. I was just asking the same questions. Does anyone else have any favorites that have stood out from museums you've visited in the past?
Um, David, I was going to say Gardner Supply, but I don't work there anymore. The Shelburne Historical Society, and I remember going to, I think it was the Independence, Mount Independence, and they had three militiamen, all in white, and we were standing there during a presentation, and different parts of the room would light up, and all of a sudden, they had this video show up on their face, and it was like these real guys were talking to you. So it was bordering on a little bit creepy, but it caught your attention for sure. So it was semi-interactive, but it was pretty amazing what happened and how they did it.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing.
Mhm.
Anyone else have any that have
Uh,
stood out?
it's funny that Danielle mentioned Lynchburg, Virginia. I used to live there, but one of my favorite interactives, and I think this will ring a bell with a lot of people, is going out to the old Appomattox Courthouse and seeing the the what do you call them? The enactors, the people who are there to explain, and they stay in character, and they tell you about what life was like, during the 1860s, and where they, you know, those are in my opinion, that's one of the most effective interactive things you can do in a museum.
Yeah, so having kind of that immersive living history aspect of it.
And
And then,
and we do that. We used to, and we're trying to put it back together. We were on a bus tour, and we would have local residents stationed at different places around the town of Lunenburg here up in the Northeast Kingdom. And you could get a cemetery tour to see that, Harry Truman's grandmother's stepfather or something like that was buried there. But we had docents. So docents, um, and actors, whatever, having actual people are the most impressive interactives that I've run across in my history.
then we have in the chat the Blue Mountain Lake Adirondack Museum. So interactive maps with boats and moving trains. So a lot of immersive sounds and sights. And then they also used iPads to practice art techniques in the painting room. And then Fort Ticonderoga is another example mentioned in the chat.
I would offer something, but I don't know if it
Yes.
comes through.
Did you add it to the chat?
I have no idea where that is. It
Oh,
doesn't
that's all
show up.
right.
Hold
Do you
on.
want to just verbally share then?
Okay. Well, there have been a couple of museums I've gone to. The first one is in Czechoslovakia. And initially, when you go into the museum, there's a QR code that takes you to the site Bloomberg. Are you familiar with Bloomberg?
To the website or to a historic site?
Bloomberg Philanthropics. Bloomberg
No.
Philanthropics actually sets up sites and hosts sites for museums around the world.
Okay.
So anyway, so I scanned the QR code. It opened up, and then as you went along, there were QR codes for particular exhibits, numbered and whatnot. And so you could put anything that you wanted on there. And I guess that's not necessarily interactive, except that you scan it and you listen to it and that kind of thing. The notable thing, though, is that when you get home, you can still pull up that museum and any other museum that Bloomberg did. So I know that's not necessarily interactive, but has anyone used QR codes extensively to highlight and maintain exhibits?
We use them actually currently as a placeholder for our oral history station. So we're in the process of updating that, and that'll be something I touch base on a little bit later.
Okay, and forgive me, I came in a little bit late, but Danielle, you are with?
Oh, yes. So I'm a museum educator with Vermont Historical Society.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're at the Vermont Historical Society Museum?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah. And then we've also got museums in England, France, and Belgium, World War II museums in France with movie reels from each country. So we can see like a wide range of the ways museums can add interactives into the space. So that can be everything from actually having volunteers or paid participants going in as either docents to guide an activity or going in as living history models. But we can also see it through really immersive exhibits that integrate different either archival or auditory cues, and then some of those digital interactives that go into museums as well. So Eileen, can we go to the next slide? So I heard a couple of people kind of going back and forth about whether something really counts as an interactive in a museum, and what an interactive can be a wide range of things in a museum space. So it just makes sure that you're engaging on another level with either the objects on display in the museum or some of the information that's being present. And one thing that I wanted to kind of just head off immediately is a lot of times we can make assumptions that interactive stations or interactivity in museums is kind of only for kids. And there's a lot of different ways that interactives can actually help a wide range of visitors within your space. So for visitors, interactives can actually provide a different framework for people of all ages and learning preferences to go through and access information. So, for example, if you're going in and you have that ability to scan something on your phone and go link what you're seeing in a museum to different sites, that's going to give you a bit more of a basis for where some of those things exist in a larger cultural context. So there's all these different methods of learning that an interactive can help make accessible in a museum. And then there's also a lot of ways in which that can help really start that immersion process. So it's a lot easier if you're stepping into a historic site and you can see some of those objects and actions in situ. That makes it a lot easier to imagine yourself in the 1850s in Vermont. But interactives can also be really beneficial if you are looking to expand some of those age divisions in your museum. Lots of times, what we'll see is that, at least in my case, families with younger children will come into the museum and say, "Oh, I don't know that this would be a good idea. I've got a 3-year-old with me." So, some of those concerns with parents about their children being able to access those kinds of materials. But a 3-year-old being able to come in and go right into our wigwam that we have at the museum, we have a lot of different touch stations throughout. So just kind of figuring out, like, what's the difference between a fox pelt and a beaver when they go into a museum, and being able to really get some of those sensory cues when they go in. One thing that I find really helpful, kind of in a larger sense, is AAM actually also has data that they shared from the Wilkening Consulting Group. So one of their main targets in their 2024 survey was looking at different levels of educational access in museums and how that then speaks to different audiences between public, private, and homeschools. And one of the things that they found is kind of unanimously, a lot of people go to museums because they want an experience that's going to be both social and educational. So when we go to museums, more often than not, we want them to kind of engage in a different level with information, either historically, scientifically, or in terms of art history. But we do want them to actually spark that kind of imagination when we enter those spaces. And then Catherine Hayes just mentioned we recently found a pelt in our collection, still in pretty good shape. So actually, this might be of interest to a couple people. We don't pay anything for our pelts. They're actually on loan from the Vermont Trappers Association because they loan out the different animal pelts for educational purposes. So once they've been thoroughly used in the wigwam that we have at the very front of the museum, they actually go back to that association and they're able to use them.
Can't see what it is. I can't read that, so I don't know.
So they're able to use them then for different crafting. So nothing really goes to waste in that. Okay. Does anyone have any questions before we move on? Awesome. So we can go ahead to the next slide, Eileen. Okay. So interactives in a museum space are informal educational environments. One visitor is not going to have the exact same experience that other visitors have when they go into the space, and that's because they're different areas of the museum are going to speak to different interests of the visitors. But three things that a lot of interactive stations have in common, and things that you might want to consider if you're thinking about adding interactives to your space, are what kinds of sensory cues you're going to put in. So that's allowing visitors to immerse themselves in the exhibit through sight, sound, touch, or smell. Probably not a good idea to include taste in that, but you can. Providing a multitude of different sensory cues can be beneficial, especially if visitors have auditory or sight processing issues. Then that can make the information available in a multitude of different methods. And then, since museums are things that people typically visit as a social experience, interactive stations can also be really helpful if you're trying to prolong some of that time that your visitors are spending in the space. Provide them some discussion prompts when they're in there, either directly or indirectly. But that can be beneficial to have visitors go back and think about their prior knowledge and how that's changed now that they've visited the museum. And then the biggest component of that is going to be what visitors can physically manipulate in the space through the educational objects on display. So if you are able to add tactile experiences, then that can be really beneficial. Not only for younger children if we're thinking about play, but in mimicking some of those historic tasks when you're in a museum space. One of the ones that we recently added to our exhibit at the Vermont History Museum is a wool carding station. So we have a station that explains the entire process of carding wool and turning it into a rolag. Most of the times people come up and they'll see the two carders and just kind of automatically go to them instead of the instructions. So the way we've gotten around that is we've actually placed instructions again on the objects themselves so that they demonstrate how to pull the rolags or to pull the carders apart from each other in order to process the wool. But that gives our visitors a lot more experience where they're able to go in and see what does wool processing look like at this step in the process, and how does that then continue down until it becomes yarn.
What?
Excellent. So let's go ahead to the next slide. Okay. So this is a diagram that we actually adapted from purposeful museum programming using visitor response pedagogies by Ames Morton Winter. So this is looking specifically at some guided programs that you can use in museum spaces and ways that you can use those in non-guided experiences as well. So that's really going to be up to you to determine with your capacity in creating interactive spaces. It can be very time consuming to have someone stationed at an activity the entire time. So that's going to be something that you want to consider in terms of volunteer manpower and time that you would like to put into some of these things. But they don't necessarily have to be a guided experience, and none of ours are in the museum. We don't have that capacity right now. But the four components that we can use in both non-guided and guided activities in terms of visitor response pedagogies are encouraging those close looking activities. So where a visitor is going up and observing a specific object in the collection, interactives can be really helpful for them to look closer at some of the materiality of that object on display and kind of form a closer connection that they might not get from just looking at the object. Collaboration, if they're working together on a certain task, that kind of goes hand in hand with my bottom point on communication, but where visitors can actually go in and have a tactile effect on the space, that can be really important to have some of those teamwork exercises available as well. And then active listening, if we're thinking about archival footage in the museum, or even just more of that discussion with some of the members of their party that might be visiting the museum as well, that can be really beneficial to kind of have a way to direct some of those conversations as people go through the space. Okay. And if we want to go to the next slide. So if we're thinking about interactives that a lot of you would like to add to your spaces, either as a local historical society or museum, what would be the main idea that you would want visitors to take away from adding an interactive to that space? Does anyone currently have any kind of interactive stations in their museum? No one does.
I could offer one thing, that the exhibit we're doing at the museum, your museum, involves 7 co-exhibitors, local historic societies. So the concept would be that each mini exhibit that the Historic Society would have at your museum would also be available interactively and online at their museum. So in other words, if we create one, then they can share that. My thought on it is that, and I would guess it'd be about the same for anyone, is that you want people to be able to access what they've experienced at your museum or whatever, wherever that might be. In other words, they can take it with them. I think that continuity actually represents a real augmentation of their memory. You know, I mean, it's one thing to go in and see something and then, well, you're going to go get a creamy or something like that. So you kind of forget it. But if you know that it's online, then you can re-access those things and actually, to a degree, create new memories of a place that you visited, but you are no longer there. So continuity of memory, I think, is something we want to take away.
So being able to access the information in multiple spaces, that's definitely, we recently added a station in our museum for an exhibit on a local photographer from Montpelier. So that's Orrin Hills operated a commercial photography studio from about the 1910s into the 1940s. So what we did, because we weren't able to process the entire collection as part of the exhibit, is we actually added a station where people can go to our online database and look at the rest of his photographs that have been digitized. So that's something that we're constantly adding to, but they're able to access it in both spaces. And it also promotes the fact that we have a digital platform that they can access for other materials as well. And then
I'm assuming then that they could also go home and
yes,
access
they
the
can
same
go home
material.
and access the database online
So
as well.
that's a degree of accessibility that probably should be emphasized.
Yeah, so that's a really good point to make, especially if you are in a historic building that might not have an accessible entrance to, let's say, the second floor. That can be a really good tool to have at your disposal to allow visitors some form of still engaging with the materials. So you can do that either through staging a virtual tour. So a lot of smartphones actually have the capacity to record a panorama in a space, so that could be helpful to have at your disposal if you do have a visitor that's unable to access a space in the museum. Then we have had fun while learning, learning empathy or a new perspective, um, discovering that there are multiple perspectives on any given topic. That's good. Um, and then visceral appreciation of local history that inspires them to tell others and want to learn more. So really kind of getting more of that sense of place when they visit a museum. Those are all great things to consider when we're thinking about building our museum spaces up. And I'm actually going to guide you through three different examples that we have currently at the Vermont History Museum and the different methods that we use at each of these stations. So Eileen, can we go to the next slide? Okay, so I've seen a couple people talking in the chat about different scents and sights as part of an immersive technique in the museum. We actually have one of those in the museum currently. So at our in about the 1850s section of the museum, visitors are able to enter a general store. And in the general store, they can see the objects on display on a rack so they can go up and look closely at some of the things that would be imports in a Vermont general store in the 1850s and some of the things that would have been brought out from Vermont farms to be sold in the stores. And to think a little bit more of those imports and exports that they have in the museum, when they exit the general store, we have a scent station that's available. So what visitors do is they will open one of the lids on the bottom here, and they will be able to experience a scent. So we have coffee, ginger, tobacco, and a couple other cloves are the last one. But they have to be able to identify those when they're at the station, and then they can lift the second flaps at the top to learn more about where those objects would have come from, since Vermont farmers are obviously not growing coffee beans in the 1850s. What I like the most about this type of setup for our scent station is that there are multiple levels of access that you can experience when you go to the station. So if you're going in and you're just trying to identify familiar versus unfamiliar scents, that's absolutely fine. And you don't have to, that's as far as the interactive can go, if that's what a visitor would like for their experience. But they're also able to then go in and lift these and go back into the store to identify where some of those scents exist within a larger historical context of Vermont stores. And this is a station that's fairly easy to recreate on a smaller scale. If you're looking at something like that, we're actually thinking about it for a Maple interactive that's going in another space in the museum. One thing that I like to keep in mind is that smells can also be overwhelming as a sensory experience sometimes in spaces. So we want to make sure that those kinds of things are optional when a visitor comes into the museum so that they're not being overwhelmed. But these are all, we just have, it's literally a cup full of coffee beans and cloves and a little cotton ball that's dyed with tobacco. And we just replace those every couple months or so. So that's how we keep up our general store scent station. And then we have in the chat, we have a Create Kids Cove that allows people to play and experience what life was like at the Bay in the early 1800s, and then interacting with some of that technology from that period. And that's one of the things that we typically do as well. As I'll reach out to our collections manager or vice versa when we are deaccessioning things from our collection. Those can very easily be turned into educational interactives in a museum space. And the only thing to keep in mind in that transition from something being deaccessioned into the museum to becoming an interactive in your space is that it is at that point disposable, which means that eventually, hopefully not right away, it will break down from continued usage. And working predominantly with kids, they find creative ways to make those kinds of things happen in the museum space. All right. Does anyone have any questions about the scent stations or different interactive? How do you keep scents fresh? So they'll kind of naturally degrade over time. So what we'll do is we'll just buy in bulk some of those scents we actually go down to the co-op in Montpelier and refresh each of those stations. We're thinking about something similar for a Maple interactive that's going later in the museum. All right, do we want to go to the next slide? Okay, so later in the museum in about the 1860s to 1870s, visitors enter a space through our Civil War gallery that then takes them into an exploration of Vermont railroads and transportation. And in that space, we actually have a telegraph station. So in the back, you can see behind this kid's head, they can't see my mouse. Can they on here? No. All right. So behind the child's head at the very front, there's a letter writing station. So kids at the end of the table can go in and write a letter to place in the back. So we've got a lot of them over the years. I think my favorite was someone pretending like they were in the movie Back to the Future. So they were asking Doc Brown to go and meet them at the Montpelier Clock Tower. So people kind of immerse themselves in that space and then send letters to either send letters to someone that they're visiting the museum with, or kind of thinking of themselves as responding to somebody in the past. But at the very end of the table, we actually have a real telegraph station that visitors are able to interact with. So we have the pedal, and then they can actually see the machine right here. Our telegraph is actually connected to a second station that's in the other room right behind this group of students. So someone could go into the other space and actually receive a message from the telegraph station itself. So I have it set up where they can go in and they have a version of the Morse code alphabet available in both spaces. So if you're practicing sending a letter or sending a message and receiving it, you can do so in both spaces. So that's what this group of students is actually doing. They have just out of frame, there's another student in that space. So they were typing the word hi to each other back and forth. But again, this type of interactive has multiple methods of accessibility. So students can go in and they can just tap away, not necessarily sending a message, but just seeing what this method of communication would look like in the 1870s and having a tangible experience with that. Or they can go in and they can send those letters and write messages in Morse code as well. Any questions about this station in the museum? Okay, so the very last one that we have is actually a more recent addition that we put in when we changed over our Civil War gallery in the fall of 2023. So we actually had the light issue like 3 days before Montpelier flooded, so we got all of our Civil War uniforms and everything out of the space, which was perfect timing before we had to close for 3 months. But one of the things that we wanted to do in this station was we have this really fantastic painting by an artist named James Hope from Vermont. So James Hope was actually deployed as part of the Vermont 2nd Regiment, and while he was stationed down in Virginia, he actually completed a lot of different sketches of the Vermont Brigade while they were in camp. So this is the Vermont Fredericksburg winter camp from 1861 to 1862. So this is all based on sketches that that James Hope did before he actually went back home, because he was medically discharged from the war. So James Hope's hope with some of these paintings was that he was going to later create a panorama of the American Civil War, which was a really popular type of exhibit, of traveling exhibit that that was available at this time. So he has this one of the Vermont Brigade during their winter camp in Fredericksburg, but then he has another one of the Army of the Potomac as well. All that being said, this painting is kind of buried behind a lot of other visually interesting artifacts that we have on display in the museum. So I wanted to create a station where visitors could go in and learn a little bit more about about the painting, and actually be able to engage in some close looking exercises. So what we have currently is a digital kiosk that I actually created with Canva, and which has a free version of a website development tool. So people can go in and actually click on different aspects of the painting, and that'll lead them to a second page that'll link to different archival letters. So we have another one from a person in another Vermont regiment who is actually writing to his wife about camping in Fredericksburg as well. So we're able to add some of those other perspectives that we might not otherwise be able to get in this part of the exhibit. But it gives us a lot of opportunities when we're thinking about interactive stations. That gives us a lot of time to expand on some of the storytelling aspects that we're doing in an exhibit. So multiple levels of access when we're going in. Any additional questions about this, about any of the spaces that we just looked at in the museum?
Question.
Yes.
Is there one of the things I'm thinking is interactive questions. For example, if they're in one section of the exhibit, as you just said, which is essentially online, could you include something where they, at that moment, can ask a question and perhaps it be answered later on? In other words, as though there was someone there and they say, well, gee, what about this right here? Then you could field that question and later on get back to them, which is a time stretched interactivity, but I think would probably be something that would be memorable for someone, as well as answering the question.
So providing a space where they're able to go in and ask a question and have a possible follow-up later from a member of your
maybe just
organization.
A touch button. Let's say that you're doing this painting that you have here,
Mm-hmm.
and something comes up and they say, well, gee, I wonder about this. Touch a button, make a recording, have that fielded later, and answer their question later. That also would relieve you of having to have somebody there all the time to answer that question.
That can be useful, and we do have a lot of spaces in the museum where it's kind of open-ended, or has an open-ended version of that, where they're able to either add their own experience in a location. So, for example, at the end of the museum, people are able to create their own Vermont story postcard. So we'll have a lot of people interact with that station and state where they're visiting from. I think, just from my experience at least, I like those kinds of interactions with visitors when I'm at the front desk, where someone will come in. Just like a couple days ago, we actually had a teacher come in from Bennington, and she was curious about some of the spittoons that we had on display in the general store. So she came up to the front and she had the catalog with her, because we have that printed out so people can look at the different objects in the store. And she couldn't figure out what those two objects were at the very front of the Bennington pottery. So it was that interaction where we went in and immediately look at them. I know that's where our spittoons are in that part of the exhibit. So I don't know. I think that's kind of that's up to you to determine what feels best for that kind of level of interaction with visitors. But yeah, I don't know. I think that there's a lot of value in that being um kind of just an in-person interaction that they get when they're
Yeah,
at the
no,
museum.
I totally agree with that.
Yeah.
The experience, though, I think everybody's had is that you go into a museum
And
and
they don't
you're
know.
not there. Yeah,
Yeah.
and they don't know, and they say, and I don't, well,
Yeah.
maybe I could, and so you're left with this hanging thing. But if there were a way to say interactively that we can get back to you on that,
Hmm.
it also would inform the exhibitor on
Yeah.
what people are interested in and so expand it. I mean, it's a time delayed interaction, but it's exactly right. You would like to be all the time for that person to answer those questions, and this gives you an option of doing that in time delay. No, I don't know.
Yeah.
Not
It's
either or,
definitely
but both.
it's definitely something to consider
Mhm.
if you're thinking about adding some of those to your
Yeah.
space.
And you're already
And
doing it anyway with that
that's true.
postcard. Like if they come back and they say, "Well, I'm interested in this and this," and they make that postcard, then yeah, it's still a time delay, but that's a fascinating idea. It's a great idea.
Well, and with those, I personally like going through and seeing just the different everyone's story when they go into that part of the exhibit. So if you're all looking for ways for visitors to also provide feedback or share with the museum,
Mhm.
those kinds of interactive stations are perfect for that level of interaction. And people love leaving their own mark on an area. So that's a really great station to add.
Mhm.
And with that in mind, Eileen, do we want to go to the next slide? Okay. So, just a really quick note as we're thinking about building out some of these interactive stations, that it's really important to consider levels of access when we're building these parts of the museum. So, if you're looking at something that has a multiple step guidelines available at the interactive station, you want to make sure that that is available in a visibly accessible prompt right when someone goes to that station. And then I think that playtesting is really important when you're in museums. So that's something that I will typically, when we go in and have new versions of these stations going up in the museum, I'll typically grab somebody to try it out for a moment and see if it makes sense. But one thing you want to consider is if a visitor could have a fulfilling experience at that station with and without guidance and how that becomes different. And then again, thinking about the different sensory cues in the exhibit, if you have a bunch of sounds all grouped together in one area, it might be a good idea to have those available via a set of headphones. So there's telephone receiver connections that you can actually get for iPads. And we have found that kids think it's the funniest thing that they've ever seen. So anytime they go into the museum exhibit, they immediately gravitate towards those phone receivers because they're not used to using those. So they'll go in and they'll actually listen to the audio at those stations. So not only are they getting a chance to pick something up in the exhibit and interact with it more, but it also makes sure that another visitor going through that space isn't going to be bombarded with 1,000 different auditory cues happening at the same time and getting overwhelmed in that space. And then also thinking about the different heights of your signage. So there are ADA guidelines, which will give you directions on how to make those wheelchair accessible or accessible to smaller children. But those will be really important, just making sure that somebody can go up and access that station. And we also on the worksheet have provided a link to the Center for Universal Design, which can give a lot better directions on how to make those kinds of spaces meaningful. And then if we want to go to the next slide. So for interactive spaces, they can often be intimidating as something that's going to be a big drain on time and money. There are a lot of different ways that you can add interactives into a museum with little to no budget at all. So like I said, with our Scent Station, that's we had the initial startup for making that space in the museum, but it's not a long-term cost for us because it's just getting those materials every year or two to refresh the station. But if you want to make something in your museum so that people can go in and interact with objects that they might not otherwise be able to touch or see in the museum, you can get different fabric swatches of the same type of material. That can be really important for a touch station. Joann's is going out of business. We can stock up on those kinds of supplies and add that into the space if you wanted to have a space where a visitor can touch silk or wool within the museum. One thing that a lot of people take home at our museum is we actually have archival recipes printed out in the tavern as well. So those are things that visitors can then take and do later when they're at home. So we have a lot of those recipes in our library as well. And then, like we discussed earlier, having those kinds of prompt stations can really provide visitors with a unique opportunity to write back and respond to a question in the museum or to kind of just leave their mark and say, hey, I visited here in 2025. With that, I think, how are we doing on time, Eileen?
So we've about 12 minutes or so left. Let me
Okay.
just see what was our next.
That's the
With our
testing.
brainstorm.
Okay, so
Yes.
perfect. We have plenty of time. So what I wanted to do is for our kind of final portion, I wanted to think about three different types of objects that we have in our collection and that a lot of you are going to see different versions of in your object collections as well. So we have a profile portrait, we have a 3D object, and then we have archival materials with a songbook. So visual artifact, an artifact that's an actual object. So we have the wooden skis from the Austin School for the Deaf, and then we have a songbook for Hale, Vermont. So what I want you to think about is what kind of interactives could you make to accompany one of these objects if they were on display in your museum? And that'll actually be a prompt on the next station if you want to look at them for a second. We don't necessarily need to know anything in particular about these objects. It's kind of thinking about if you have something that's similar in your collection, how you would access that. Oh, so having directions for a dance or have a version of the song available so that people can sing. That would be cool, kind of like a karaoke version of it. Be neat. Or if you have an archival recording of the song, that might be interesting to have as a listening station so that you can both visually look at the songbook, but then also actually hear what the music would sound like. We actually have Rockingham currently has an exhibit on display in our local history gallery. And one of the ways that they've gotten around this wonderful church book that they have on display in the gallery is they have a digital scan of the book. So obviously visitors can't go up and flip the book itself, but you have the physical object there in the space, and then right next to it is that kiosk that lets you flip through the entire book. What else could we do with any of those objects? Ooh, okay. Ask people about their impressions of the person in the portrait. Yeah, so thinking about some of the different cues that portrait artists are using um, in that time period. Take the old portrait and have visitors redraw it as a modern portrait. What would change and what would stay the same? Well, yeah, so thinking about different cues in the portrait and how those change over time. That's actually that's one of the questions I get the most when we're in our Snelling conference room is a lot of kids will notice the three portraits of children that we have in that gallery, and they'll point out that they're holding a little red book. So that's meant to show literacy in the portrait, but they'll kind of ask those questions like, what does that mean? So thinking about some of the different physical objects that portrait artists are using, photocopies of some of the songs. Yeah, so thinking about like a version of that you can take home with you, a video of what the skis would look like shooting down the mountain, and then short repeating video of the skis actually in action. Yeah, that would be interesting. So if you had archival footage of someone using a doesn't even necessarily have to be the exact same skis that you have in your object collection, but of a similar time period. That would be interesting as well. One thing I'll point out if I guess we can't go back to the previous slide. I don't know if that'll delete any of the responses that we've got. I'll also point out that this is a profile portrait. So this was actually made using Alfred Randall's silhouette, and then the artist went in and filled in the details. So that's why he's kind of posing at a weird angle. It's because it's based on his shadow. So one thing that you could also do is if you have a blank wall right next to where that portrait is, that can easily become a silhouette drawing activity as well. So people can actually try to make their own silhouette. Let's see, it didn't save it. And then for the portrait, samples of the clothing to try on and a light to do their own shadow portrait as well. Yeah, so that would be interesting looking at the different types of materials as well. Some of that. Oh, it did come up. Awesome. Audio recording of the songs. That would be really cool if you have that in your collection as well. It might be interesting if you're thinking about the different materials used in the skis construction, having some of those available as a touch station as well would also be an option. But yeah, there's lots of different ways that we can build interactives into museum spaces, and they benefit all visitors that come into a space. So it really makes it accessible to a lot of different perspectives and learning styles when visitors come into our museum spaces. And personally, I'm the type of person anytime I visit a museum that's not mine that I have to touch all of the buttons immediately. That's just where my brain goes. Does anyone have any questions in our last 5 minutes or so? Thinking about different interactives and how you can put those in your museum space.
I have a question that is, when you're designing something, you obviously have an audience in mind, and this may be an offline question, but I'd just be, because I always struggle, we don't have very many visitors here, but just curious what your demographic is for the museum. You know, if you're trying to target somebody, clearly you want to design it for that target audience, but who are they besides older folks? And what percentages, et cetera?
That's a great question. So, for our museum, we receive about 3,000 school visitors a year. So that's certainly an audience that I'm keeping in mind every time we create one of those interactive stations. I would say it really depends on the exhibit itself, and which area of it I'm looking at. So, for example, if I'm looking at our farming station, that's kind of towards the front of the exhibit, I want that to be accessible to kindergarten and up, when a visitor is coming into that space. So they can come in and touch the wool, they can practice carding. They're not necessarily going to be going in and reading an entire station that's all about the American Civil War. So it's really just keeping in mind, yeah, just what age groups you typically see in the museum. But if you're looking at expanding some of those age demographics, it might be worth kind of thinking more about those multiple levels of access so
So
that
once,
your
excuse me.
continued visitors can still enjoy the space, but that might also provide a prompt for a family with young children to come in and also visit.
So the bulk of your visitors then school trips?
No. So it's actually seasonal, for our museum. So in the fall, we get a lot of leaf peepers. So that's all of our bus tours that come in. So it's um, typically an adult audience in the fall, and then, kids are predominantly going to be the main audience in the spring. And then the rest of the time, it's kind of a mixture. It depends on which day it is, which you'll see.
Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. Any additional questions?
I have a recommendation.
Yes.
The theory in the background is nice, but how do you do QR codes? What are the steps we go through to do the
Ah,
QR codes? How do we
so
tie the Canva into an actual exhibit and make those connections to the background material? Um,
that's a great
yeah,
question.
this is kind of not very helpful practically.
Yes. So, when you're thinking about those kinds of stations, those are actually, QR codes are, they're in the free version of Canva, so you're able to generate those links directly, into the space. I will say, if you're thinking about using QR codes in a museum, the only thing I recommend is they can be kind of tricky, and they don't necessarily age in place, I guess is the way I'd like to put it, where they, links can break, and and they will get worn over time.
Yep.
So they're really more of a temporary fix, but they do have those free versions of both programs
Yeah, but
available in the software.
a program like this that would go and walk us through those steps and demonstrate
Okay.
it. For those of us that don't have that technical background or resources.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question, Bill. I'm gonna that might be one sort of less like a roundtable, but maybe something where like a short tutorial kind of thing. I
Yeah,
think
something
pretty,
hands-on
yeah,
practical.
quick. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, because there are more and more options out there for creating them, but right, I would agree that if you don't happen to know or already work with a program that does it,
Yeah.
uh, it can be kind of like, where do we start?
And if you have some expertise, then
Yeah, great.
I'd love to build off your
Okay,
expertise.
excellent. Okay, wrote that down. All
But thank you
right.
all so much for joining us today. Is there anything else need to get a computer?
Under volunteers.
Yes. High
Maybe your
schoolers are
interactive can
definitely,
be create a
an
QR code
option
for
for
us.
that. Yeah. If you But if you do have access to local high school volunteer programs,
Find a child.
That's me. I'm the
Yeah.
computer nerd that helps everybody else in town.
There you go. You just need one. Spread them around.
fun. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I ended up going around and talking to different people needed help. I set up the computer and the printer for the town clerk for elections. You know, you need a computer nerd around.
But I'll also say interactives, they don't need to be tech heavy at all. And it depends on what you're really looking for in that space because I'm currently building with some tech options that we have in our oral history station. So we're actually I'm going to be programming a website for that station so people can go in and listen to specific audio clips. Tech interactives though don't age very well. And they tend to be the stations that are going to have the shortest lifespan because they'll eventually become out of date. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. Even though they're flashy, they're not necessarily going to be the best long-term solutions for accessing the space. But thank you all so much for joining us today. I guess I'll just give a quick shout out, shamelessly, that we're coming up on a Vermont History Day in about a month. So I can see Peter is actually in the call right now. So we have a couple, and Elise. So we have a couple of people that are actually volunteers for Vermont History Day as part of our judges. We're still looking for a couple additional judges for Vermont History Day. So if that's something that you're interested in, please feel free to shoot me an email, or if you have any questions about interactives and some of the things we've done in the museum, I'm also happy to touch base about either of those things. But thank you so much for joining us today on the call.
Great. Thank you again, Danielle and everybody. I put the link to the associated worksheet in the chat, but I'll send that as well out with the link to the recording again. And thanks everybody for joining us, and we hope you have a good rest of the day. Thanks again. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.